You're probably familiar with some of Atari's franchises like Astroids, Centipede, Missile Command, and so on. You see these get released on compilations all the time, but you never see Paperboy, Marble Madness, or Gauntlet on any Atari collections. These were all made by Atari, right? Let's take a look. What's going on? It's Podrez coming at you with another video. Okay, we're going to be talking about Atari games today. If that sounds interesting to you, hit that subscribe button right there. I'm trying to see if it's possible to hit 50,000 subscribers by the end of the year. Only you can help me get there. And we have an amazing community in our Discord server. If you want to be a part of it, just go to discord.podrez.net. I'll also put a direct link right in the description. Okay, we're gonna waste no time. Let's get started. You might be familiar with Tengen, who made a bunch of unlicensed games on the NES. Many people consider them to be Atari, but is that really the case? Let's start from the beginning. Atari Incorporated, or Atari Inc., had some initial success with the 2600. After securing the license to Space Invaders, they released a version that you could play at home. Given the popularity of Space Invaders in the arcade, it became one of Atari's best-selling games. The 2600, which was originally struggling, became a bestseller. This would establish the console as a way that you could play arcade games at home. From here, Atari would start prioritizing licensed properties, whether it was a popular arcade game or a well-known cartoon character. Consumers were more likely to buy a game if it has Mickey Mouse on the cover or if it's based on a well-known arcade game. Unfortunately, this would lead to some mistakes. Atari Inc. secured the license to Pac-Man, which should have been a project they took their time on, but instead they rushed. The main developer, Todd Fry, was only given a short amount of time to make this game. Atari also didn't allow him to use an 8KB cartridge, which would have given him more breathing room. The result is a game that barely resembles Pac-Man. Considering that Pac-Man was one of the most successful arcade games of all time, you would think Atari would have prioritized this game, but apparently not. It seemed like Atari had a quantitative approach with their games. It was all about meeting deadlines, obtaining licenses, and cutting costs whenever possible instead of making a game that was actually good. It wasn't just Pac-Man either. Consumers were losing interest in video games in general because they didn't know what they were getting. Imagine buying a game because it's based on your favorite movie and then finding out that the developers rushed it in 5 weeks. The video game crash was a period in 1983 and 1984 where video games were not profitable at all because consumers were losing interest in them. Some of Atari's practices, like focusing on quantity over quality, has a lot to do with why the crash happened in the first place. With video games not selling anymore, Atari was not doing well financially. As a result, the owner of Atari, Warner Communications, sold the consumer products division to Jack Tramiel, who would rename the company Atari Corporation. Atari Corporation had a whole new team of employees, but they still had the console rights to the Atari name and they got all of Atari's assets. Warner Communications held on to the arcade division along with employees from Atari Inc. because the arcade scene was still making money. This new company, called Atari Games, didn't have access to any of Atari's IPs like Astroids or Centipede, so if they wanted to publish any games, they would have to start from scratch. There was an agreement between Warner Communications and Jack Tramiel where Atari Games always had to put games after Atari to differentiate it from Atari Corporation. They also had to go under a completely different name should they ever choose to publish console games. This is why they published NES games under the name Tengen. Their first game was actually created before the company Atari Games was officially formed, Marble Madness. The game had an interesting development history with many different ideas that were being thrown around. It was originally going to be a tie-in to Michael Jackson's Thriller, but that ended up not happening. The lead developer, Mark Kearney, originally wanted a miniature golf type of game, but later on, it would become a game where you could control the ball directly. Marble Madness was actually programmed in the language C rather than assembly because it was easier, but it meant that the final game would only run at 30 FPS instead of 60. It's an isometric platformer where you must reach the finish line before the time runs out. The sooner you finish, the more bonus time you get on the next level. If you fall from too high of a point or get hit by an enemy, you lose some time. You only get one life, so if you run out of time, it's an automatic game over. Not even an extra coin will let you continue. Even though it's only isometric, the 3D perspective is very convincing, and the graphics overall are well done. The game is super challenging. The enemies will purposely try to ram you off stage or delay your journey. The controls are slippery, so it's hard to keep yourself on stage and not fall off by accident. Nonetheless, it's still a fun experience and a unique idea for a game. The NES version was actually developed by Rare instead of Atari Games. I'm honestly surprised at how well this one turned out. The 3D perspective still looks very good, and the controls feel similar to the arcade version even though that one used a trackball. I didn't think a game like this would have been possible on the NES, but I was wrong. In February of 1985, Atari Games released Paperboy. The concept was originally thought of by the game designer Dave Ralston, who used to deliver papers when he was a kid. The original game was going to feature more goofy characters like ghosts, ducks in business outfits, and giant snails, but the game was not well received because it wasn't a realistic environment. The developers would change the characters to ones that you would typically see in a suburban area, like kids playing on the street and people driving. The control scheme was an actual bicycle, which made you feel like you were really the Paperboy. You play as a young man who must deliver newspapers to every subscriber on your route. You can pick between 3 routes at the beginning, which vary in difficulty. You can slow down and speed up, but you're always moving forward so you can't make a complete stop. Crashing into anything is an automatic death, and if you miss any of your customers, they will unsubscribe. If that's not enough, you only have a limited number of newspapers, but you can collect more throughout the stages. The biggest challenge is the one-hit deaths. The streets are filled with obstacles, and just one collision is an instant death. The controls are slippery too, so it can be hard to maneuver through tight spaces. I always admired the 3D isometric graphics and how much detail and personality the neighborhood has. Doesn't this guy look like Bill Dauterive? Overall, this is easily one of Atari Games' best titles. The NES version is actually one of the first US developed games, although not by Atari Games. Outside of a minor graphical downgrade, the game looks and plays similar to the original. Even the diagonal scrolling remains, which is not something the NES can do easily. The controls are actually a little better. You're not as slippery in this version, and it's easier to aim. Overall, it's surprising how well this version turned out. Here's a more obscure game, Peter Packrat. It's a platformer where you must collect every object and bring them back to the starting point. The more items you bring at a time, the more points you get. This looks like it would have very clunky controls, but it actually doesn't. You can drop down to any platform without taking damage or dying. You can also jump very high, and you can descend at an angle instead of falling straight down. This is not a typical early 80s arcade game that has clunky controls. You have a projectile weapon that stuns the enemies. If you hit the birds or bats, you can ride them to whatever location you want. You die in one hit, and when you do, you drop all your items in that exact location. My only complaint is the graphics. In some stages, it's hard to tell where the platforms actually are, and I don't like the color scheme they picked for most of the stages. I complimented the controls earlier, but the jumping could still be better. You can jump very high, but only straight up. You can only perform very short hops when moving left or right. This makes some platforms out of reach. I actually found this to be an enjoyable game, but the controls could have been improved a bit. Unfortunately, this game was only ported over to a few home computers, no consoles. Sometimes Atari took a concept and made it their own, like with RoadBlasters. It's a driving game where you must reach the finish line before running out of gas. Unlike your typical racing game though, you can shoot down opposing vehicles with your cannon. This is a cool concept because in other racing games, the opposing vehicles are normally an obstacle you have to drive around, but here you can destroy them. Some cars cannot be destroyed though. Similar to Paperboy, you can pick between 3 stages which vary in difficulty. The road has a nice looking 3D effect, and your vehicle has more frames of animation than I typically see in a racing game. RoadBlasters had a promotion where if you completed all 50 levels, you could receive a free RoadBlasters t-shirt. Matchbox also had a line of toys that were inspired by RoadBlasters. Pit Fighter is another unique game of its genre. It's not your typical fighting game. Instead of being confined to left and right movements, you're able to freely move in all directions. The controls are basic, where you can punch, kick, and perform a special move. You can pick between a few different characters, which all have their own abilities. There's items scattered throughout the stage that you can use against your opponent. The biggest challenge is the fact that your health is not replenished in between fights. You also only get 1 life. The game does look impressive graphically. It utilizes scaling, which gives the illusion of 3D graphics, and it was one of the first fighting games to use digitized sprites. It's not the best fighting game in the world, but it's unique. Unfortunately, many of the console ports, like the SNES one, were downgraded heavily. The 3D scaling has been removed, and now the screen only moves horizontally. The sprites and background graphics have been shrunk down, and it looks pathetic. Would you want to play this? I do gotta be fair though, outside of using Mode 7, I don't see how they could have made this on the Super Nintendo. One of Atari Games' titles would be a controversial one. The The game Tetris was originally created by Alexei Pajitnov in 1984. With the huge popularity of the game, it would be licensed to numerous companies throughout Europe and the US. With the license at hand, Atari Games published Tetris in the arcade. Surprisingly, the game was developed without the source code of the original Tetris, so it had to be completely remade from the ground up. It's Tetris, but with some cool innovations. Instead of an endless mode where the pieces gradually get faster, the game is divided into rounds. By completing a certain amount of lines, you advance to the next round. There's 3 different game modes which vary in difficulty. I'm not sure why Atari Games was so obsessed with having 3 different game modes in every single one of their games. In the medium mode, you start off with garbage on the playfield that's supposed to throw you off. In the hard mode, a random block will be added every few turns that could mess you up. The most innovative feature is the ability to play 2 players, which was not a thing in the original Tetris. There's no garbage in this mode, but you race to see who's able to complete the level the quickest. Basically, Atari Games took Tetris and added some original features. It's a cool game. Atari Games ported over their version of Tetris to the NES, but not without some controversy. Like I mentioned before, they weren't allowed to use the Atari Games name for home consoles, so they created the company Tengen. The name might be different, but it's still the exact same company. Atari Games, or Tengen, didn't like Nintendo's policies, so they published games without their consent. This is why their cartridges look so much different from a typical NES one. The NES port of Tetris actually did add some more features. You can play against the CPU, and there's even a cooperation mode where you and the computer can play on the same field. Instead of rounds, you play endlessly until you lose, and it gets faster as you progress. You can also turn pieces both clockwise and counterclockwise, which was not a feature in Tengen's original version. The NES did come out a few months after the arcade one, and it looks like Tengen did make some improvements in that time. Unfortunately, Tengen would get in some legal trouble with Nintendo over this game. When Tetris was originally licensed out, it was unclear whether that license included publication on home consoles. When Tengen obtains the license to Tetris, they published the NES game thinking that they were allowed to. Nintendo, going behind Tengen's back, went through the proper means and was able to secure the console license this time for real. After a legal battle, Nintendo ended up winning the case, and Tengen was forced to withdraw all their copies of Tetris from stores. In April of 1996, Atari Games went up for sale. The former CEO of Atari Inc., Nolan Bushnell, tried to bid on the company but was unsuccessful. Just imagine if the company went back in his hands almost 20 years after resigning. Atari Games would end up being sold to WMS Industries. The company happened to own Midway, and they decided to merge the 2 companies under the name Midway Games. In 2009, that company filed for bankruptcy, and most of Atari Games' assets were sold to Warner Bros. Interactive Entertainment, who currently has the rights to them today. This is why we don't see Paperboy, Marble Madness, or Gauntlet on Atari collections, because the rights to those properties went into the wrong hands. Arcade 1UP did strike a deal with Warner Bros. To publish some of Atari Games' titles, but otherwise Warner Bros. Has basically been sitting on these games and not doing anything with them. If the present-day Atari Interactive owns these properties, you bet they would have released these on Atari 50 or a different collection by now. If you made it this far in the video, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button right there. And how do you feel about Atari Games? Do you enjoy their arcade titles? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching.